This is Chapter 10 of Seeing the Pattern 2, Death Take You, by Aegis Shield, titled Lickety Split. Lickety Split, unbeknownst to Pinkamena, had a special love in his life that was not her. She also stayed in the ice cream parlor with them, and also took quite a bit of maintenance to care for. She was blue and silver. She was always hot in his hooves, and certainly always did her job when the stallion demanded it. Not to mention, she was 12 inches long. I speak, of course, of his favorite ice cream scoop. Sure, the shop had dozens of them, but there was one that he favored above the rest. His father, Minty Split, had passed it down to him when he'd retired, and he'd kept it like a sacred treasure. If the stallion didn't have it on him, it was at least nearby. Turning the scoop, aptly named Steely, expertly in his hooves, he made up what he was sure would be the final ice cream bowl for the night. The winter time tended to put a damper on his business, but after the whole almost being lynched incident, Ponyville had been generous to him with business. He wasn't one to look a gift pony in the mouth, either. The lone mare ho-hummed about stallion troubles, and not for the first time Lickety Split got to play the role of bartender. Ponyville didn't actually have a bar, so a parlor like his could sometimes serve the same function for any pony needing to weave a sad story. He listened politely for a time, advised the poor mare that it was probably bad to date friends who dated other friends first, and sent her on her way when her bowl was empty. "Another day, another hoof full of bits," Lickety said when he was finally done. With Pinkamena out enjoying a night off, he had the parlor to himself. Taking the toppings display from its holder behind glass, he took it gently into the freezer and set it up in its usual place. Closing up the display case, he started turning off the little neon strips that made the inside of the parlor look happy and gay. Getting a mop, he began to get his soapy water started when he heard the front above the doorbell chime. Some pony had come into the shop. Rolling his eyes with a chuckle, Lickety Split cursed himself for not locking the door first like he was supposed to at the end of the day. He came out of the little supply room and stood behind the counter, leaning past the display to the bar stool area. "So sorry, I'm closed for the—" Death sat on one of the bar stools, or rather, some semblance of sitting. His cloak covered the whole thing, and Lickety could only guess what sort of configuration his bones had gotten into to make him sit properly that way. The white stallion went icy and rigid, then started trembling like a frightened foal. Death clacked its jaws a few times, cocking its head. Both massive hooves appeared on the counter, one tapping idly. After letting the terrified stallion get a nice eyeful, he shifted and slammed a hoof on the counter. Lickety jumped with a marish shriek, his body rushing to autopilot. He knew the gesture as "service, service," which was only made when the customer was left idle for far too long and not served. Gulping, he straightened his little chest apron. He really didn't want to be within Hoof's reach of death incarnate, but his hooves carried him there anyway like a machine. "Pinky's not here," he managed to sputter out. "You'll have to come back later." Death cocked his head, jaw clattering a few more times. Was he trying to say something? The creature didn't have lips or a tongue. It was hard to tell. "What, you want ice cream?" Lickety squeaked. Death gestured to a little sign, the over-the-moon special. It was a vanilla ice cream with flecks of cookie and blue dust. It was in honor of Princess Luna's return, and was fairly popular. Lickety gulped, getting out Steely and setting to work with quivering hooves. Before long, a little mountain of vanilla had been made, then the cookie bits sprinkled on here and there. Then he went briefly into the freezer for the blue sugar dust powder. Sprinkling it generously, he surveyed his work back and forth. Putting Steely in his apron, he moved with quivering hooves to put the confection down in front of Death. The creature leaned back and forth, as though inspecting it for himself. Clatter went his jaws. One of his massive hooves went up, pointing to something on the far side of it. "What's wrong with it?" Lickety's curiosity got the better of him, and he leaned close to see. Death seized him by his mane and dragged him face first over the counter. The stallion screamed as he was held down by his mane, propped over the counter. Death raised a hoof high as it turned ethereal and ghost-like. With gusto, he plunged it into the helpless stallion's back. Lickety-Split whinnied, squirming about in spiritual agony. All four of his hooves flailed about helplessly while Death searched briefly. Ah, there it was. The stallion suddenly went limp. His expression glazed over into one of white-hot horror. Death stepped back, Clatterteeth laughing. In his hoof, he held Lickety-Split's soul. Shoving it rudely under his robes, he drew his scythe and turned to the largest flat surface he could, the floor. Celestia's brow lowered and every pony in the room stopped to stare. Was she glaring? Dang it, just wondering who's saying this bit of dialogue. Oh. If it's not okay with your majesty, I'm sure we can find another way to raise bits for the Flower Park project, said the little filly scout before her. She'd been brave enough to approach royalty for the money to buy seeds for her filly scout troop to beautify a neglected park. Now her princess was glaring at her with all the fury of 1,000 blistering suns. The poor little thing began to pee herself when the princess suddenly rushed back to the present time and situation. Forgive me. I was elsewhere for a moment. I cannot give you the money, little one, but I can certainly give you seeds from the royal gardens. Take your troop and gather seeds from there. Off with you now." She gave what was quite possibly the worst fake smile she'd given in 300 years. "The Sunshine Court is in recess. Done for today." "Sunshine Court is in recess, nay, done for today," she amended, standing quickly and beating the little filly out of her own front door. "Princess," said one of her twin private guards as they rounded a corner to finally be alone. The two solar stallions would follow her into oblivion, but Faust confound them both if they had ever seen the sun goddess scowl like that. "You're both dismissed. The remainder of the day is yours," she said over her shoulder, walking forward with authority. Both stallions stopped, slack-jawed. She never shed her private guards. But the way she just said that, it was as though they were both dead weight. The solar stallion on the right felt his lip begin to quiver, and perhaps, after 10 paces, the princess stopped and turned. "Nay, a new order," she told them, and they eagerly leaned forward. "Summon Father Time." The solar princess bade them. Both stallions nodded, snapped salutes, and rushed away. The note would cover a meeting, location, and a precise time. "Death just crossed a terrible threshold," she whispered, more to herself than any pony. As soon as Celestia arrived in the royal gardens, a blue booth of some kind sputtered into existence. The door opened, and Father Time poked his head out. "Ah, your majesty!" The brown-on-brown stallion greeted. "Came as soon as I got the note." He held up the short letter that had not actually been sent yet. "On time as usual, Father Time." Celestia smiled graciously. "Come, we have a few strings to pull." Yes, come on board then. Awfully important, this string-pulling business. Lot of rot going on if you need to step up and interfere, I bet." His short and gibbering phrases were all a part of his charm, the frequent pauses making him quite adorable. Celestia briefly entertained the idea of introducing him to her most faithful student, Twilight Sparkle, but there were more important things to do right now. "When to, princess?" Father Time adjusted his bow tie with a chuckle as the alicorn went inside the blue booth. It was much, much bigger inside than outside. "Right after Lickety-Split was attacked," Celestia said firmly after filling Father Time in on what had happened. "We need to be there and gone again before Pinkamena arrives home." "Righto then, hold on. She jaws now and then." Father Time shut the doors and they were off. The blue booth winked out of existence, traveling backward through time. Precisely 3 seconds later they returned. "That was it, really? That's all you wanted to change in the scheme of things?" The brown stallion was a little shocked to tell the truth. "Yes," Celestia said serenely, all the stress gone from her now. She lifted her wings just a little, having returned to her loving expression and lack of anxiety. "Ha! I think I'm going to go get some tea. Would you like to join me?" she said with such a charming smile that Father Time could not resist her. He bashfully took his bow tie off, assuming mortal form, and followed her into the palace. He didn't pretend to understand what the princess had done, but the sun goddess's staff did make a right good pot of tea. He couldn't miss that. Pinkamena was glad to have a clean coat and such, after all the measurements had been taken. After much fancy mathematics had been had, Twilight Sparkle had been able to tell her much about Big Macintosh just based on the hoof print. Of course she'd never said that it was Big Mac, but Twilight worked under the assumption that it was a suspect. He had to be a massive stallion, at least 150 pounds heavier than most. The width and thickness of his hoof alone told how much weight had to be distributed, not to mention his age and height range. Much could be found in a hoof print. Rushing finally to Lickety's ice cream parlor, she flung the door open, happy to be home. All the tables had been flung to either side, several windows cracked, and the tiles sliced all to Tartarus by some unknown tool. But that wasn't what drew the mayor's eye. Laying limp over the counter, still in his apron, was Lickety-Split. Her mouth went dry and a little agape while her pupils shrank into dots. "Lickety!" Pinkamena whinny screamed, thundering over the broken glass and tile. "No, no, 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 no!" She held his face, saw his lolling tongue and terrified expression. Using all her might, she pulled him off the counter, sending a melted ice cream bowl splattering wildly across the floor. "Lickety! Lickety!" She sank her teeth into his ear, pulling back and forth feverishly. She whacked him over the face several times, hyperventilating. "Huh!" escaped his mouth, and she dropped him, wide-eyed. When he made no movements or further sounds, she fell to her knees and leaned her face over his. He said again after a time. She felt a slight breeze between them. He was breathing. Pinkamena felt her body flush with relief, then leaned over him more carefully. Why was he frozen like that? He looked so terrified. She tried to shut his eyes to rest them, but they sprang open again. A creeping, aching feeling began to build over her like the tingling of a sleeping limb. Turning, she looked around again, then finally to the door. There was a method to the madness. If you want his soul back, come to Sweet Apple Acres alone tomorrow night. It was violently etched into the floor like it had been cut with a scythe. Pinkamena's lips pursed hard. It was him! I knew it was him, that bastard! Pinkamena flailed and buckled at air, a great vein appearing on her forehead. His face colored scarlet, and her body quivered with untold rage. Heaving a great breath, she let out a great, terrible cry. She saw Lickety-Split's favorite ice cream scoop laying on the floor, glittering serenely in the moonlight. I'll get him. I'll cave his bucking skull in. She swore and spat as she grabbed the instrument up. I'll do it with a bucking ice cream scoop. Cave it right in and I... The pink mare stopped, turning towards Lickety-Split. He was splayed out on the floor, getting dirty and sticky, laying in all the debris. Halting her rage and slowly decompressing, she stared down at him. Pinkamena slowly knelt down, putting her head under his side. Trying her best, she found she could not move him. A little ashamed, she dragged him across the floor of the parlor. When finally in their little living space in the back, she turned him on his side. Fetching towels and warm water, she knelt beside him. Then, like a ritual long since forgotten, she dabbed at him until he was much cleaner. He didn't appear hurt, per se. His body was steadily breathing and his heart pumping blood at an idle pace. He was just soulless. She gritted her teeth a little, using all her might to put him up on the couch. Draping a quilt over him, she sighed. "Lickety," she whispered, running a hoof over his cheek a few times. Leaning down, she offered him a long kiss. He didn't stir. This wasn't the movies, where a kiss could heal any wound or bring anyone out of a coma. Nuzzling up and down a few times, she growled to him, "Just don't go anywhere. I have to go get your soul, stupid stallion." She bopped him on the head, grabbing her saddlebag and backing away at last. Big Macintosh was nearing the end of his workday, according to the position of the sun. Just as it was dipping below the horizon, he'd hammered the last nail into place. He'd just fixed over 60 yards worth of fence line, and it looked like it could stand up to a timber wolf chewing on it. Smiling and using his mouth to put his hammer away in his toolbox, he surveyed his work. Thankfully, the tranquility of a day's work had rooted out the hot embarrassment of Pinkamena's discovery. Had she gone to tattle the Twilight Sparkle? It seemed unlikely, or the Lavender Librarian probably would have swung by the farm demanding her property. She did get temperamental now and then. It was adorable to tell the truth, but he didn't want the anger pointed at himself. The Crimson Stallion suddenly frowned, cocking his head. What was that sound? It sounded like rolling thunder, very far away from himself. He looked towards the Everfree Forest, fully expecting some ghastly creature to come barreling out. Leaning into his toolbox, he got his screwdriver, the only thing that might be a weapon for his mouth. Hooves and tools would have to do. Wait, no. It wasn't coming from the Everfree... Macintosh! The Crimson Stallion turned in audibly slow motion just in time to see a pink mare with a bannering mane do a spider stallion leap through the air. She hovered there, mouth open in a scream of rage he almost couldn't hear in his shock. Pinkamena watched his brow rise and his mouth fall open, pleased with the fear in his pin-pricking pupils as she sailed through the air upon him. She neared the apex of her leap and wrenched Steely out of her saddlebags. A good baseball swing sent the massive stallion crashing through his own fence, with the pink mare riding him like a living sled. They tumbled over the embankment while she screamed and beat him like a madmare. Blood splattered from his nostrils and he cried out audibly, scorching his throat. His massive hooves flailed wildly to defend himself, but she'd thrown him into a panic and he was all too easy to beat the daylights out of. Clank, clank, clank. She raised her ice cream scoop over her head, over and over, beating the tar out of him while he was still off balance. He whinny shrieked with each blow, squirming as she straddled him forcefully. Raining down the hurt with all her might, Pinkamena let out a high-pitched whinny of fierce battle, while she stained her weapon red. A long, curved blade interrupted Pinkamena's wild abuse and she froze. A scythe had lashed out of the twilight to stop her, coming between the pink mare and her target. Turning her head, she saw him. Death. What? She staggered off of Big Macintosh, who lay on the ground moaning incomprehensively. But you're... And he's... She gestured wildly with Steely, shaking uncontrollably. A phantom breeze pushed Death's hood back, and he stepped back a moment to let Pinkamena rise to her own hooves. She stared at his ugliness, the matted work of scars she could see even through his crimson fur. A red stallion. He looked almost like Big Mac, but even bigger. "Who are you? Who the buck are you?" she shrieked, the panic making her voice high-pitched. Death's voice was low and growly, as he heaved his scythe into the upright staff position. "I'm Papa Apple, and you need to quit abusing my son." This is Chapter 11 of Seeing the Pattern 2, Death Take You, by Aegis Shield, titled Death's Battle. Papa Apple awoke in space between spaces, clinging to the ground. He thought he could see his hooves, but he wasn't sure. "What happened to me?" he wondered aloud, peering about. "I was running to turn off the tilling machine and—" He trailed off, looking at the long and endless field. On the far horizon was a strong light. It was warm and friendly, flanked with twinkling stars and inviting comets. What a weird place this is. Then something caught his eye, a great black blob flying across the sky. It was pony-shaped and didn't seem in a particular rush. Hey, down here!" It stopped in midair and wheeled around. Then it plunged towards him at a deadly speed and landed with a stomp. "Soul, move towards the light. Thou art deceased and bound for the great beyond." It was a massive midnight mare with wings and a horn, an alicorn. "Deceased, but I feel fine," Papa Apple said, confused. "Oh, clap thy hooves together," the dark pony said with amused, lidded eyes. Papa Apple snorted and made to do so, but found he had no hooves. His whinnying shriek of shock made her laugh. "Thou art a shapeless blob of soul right now. Thou hast no hooves to clop." She caught the double meaning as soon as she said it, and it only made her laugh harder. "That's not very nice of you," Papa Apple snapped. "We are the goddess of death. We don't need to be nice," she snapped, poking at him with a massive hoof. "Besides, we aren't waiting for a little colt right now. Dost thou think he deserves special treatment as well?" Papa Apple flinched. "Little colt? You mean Big Macintosh? No, you can't have him." The very much dead stallion threw himself at the dark goddess with all his might. It was like beating someone into submission with a serving of cotton candy. You can't have my son," he shouted angrily. "He's just a little thing, and he ain't going nowhere to no great beyond or nowhere else." Though he no longer had a jaw to clench and no muscles to coil against his opposition, he was an apple. He would stand in her way as long as it took. "Done make me make you see it my way, you hussy." "Hussy?" The dark goddess stopped, her mouth a little agape. "Thou darest insult me?" she demanded, stomping her massive hooves. "Rise and say it to mine face." She gave a powerful gesture, and Papa Apple's soul was clenched in ancient magics. With a poof of shut up she's a goddess magic, she conjured a more true-to-form stallion soul shape for him. Papa Apple's ghost, in a sense. The death goddess stared at him, momentarily startled at his size. They were eye to eye. Not many ponies could brag of such stature. "Well, speak thy piece," she demanded when she got a hold of herself. "I said I'm a stand between you and my boy, death god." He told her right to her face. She blinked, just staring at him like he'd grown an extra head. No pony ever back-talked her like that. She forgot about the little red colt entirely for a few moments. This big red one was far more interesting.
And if we were to tear your soul in half and deny you an eternal bliss in the afterlife? She threatened, leaning over him with a powerful snarl. Papa Apple shoved his face into hers, and for a few scant seconds they had a push-with-your-forehead battle. He was quite strong for a mortal pony. "Then that few moments is gonna deny you my little one for as long as I could," he snapped. She was impressed, to say the least. The stallion had balls on him. To deny the gods the denial of the gods was suicide, but to achieve a goal of keeping them from something, even for a few moments, was ballsy indeed. "Thou art as stubborn as the mountains," she finally said, stepping back a moment to really survey him. He snorted hot air, pawing his ghostly hoof at the ground a little. Giving her Starry Night mane a toss, she chuckled in a mischievous way. "But how strong art thou—" She let her guard down. Her head snapped back and her pupils turned into dots as Papa Apple bucked her as hard as he could. He was pacing back and forth like an angry mountain lion, ready to do battle with her. She rubbed the underside of her chin. "Ho, ho, ho," she smirked. "Thou must hit harder if thou art to harm a goddess, we are afraid." She raised a hoof when he approached to do just that. "But thy resolve is quite powerful, we admit. What wouldst thou do to preserve thy little red colt?" "Anything. Everything," Papa Apple said, stomping his hooves back and forth like he was warming up for a race. "If I gotta do battle with a god, so be it." He reared up and whinnied powerfully, hooves the size of plates crashing against the ground. The sound of the impact echoed a bit over the flat plains. She peered about. It had been a long time since any soul, much less one with a bodily shape, had done that. His spiritual resonance was just beautiful. She held up a hoof to stop him from aiming for her face with his initial attack. "Suppose thou came to work for us instead, then?" She smiled mischievously, leaning forward with a sultry smile. "The current aspect of death is a quiet shepherd, with no stomach to grasp at those that wilt not die when they are supposed to." He blinked while she explained, taken aback. "Become our new death, and thou shalt be at right arm of— Dang it! Become our new death, and thou shalt be at the right arm of the Princess of the Night." She flourished her hoof, lightning blasting across the sky in a spectacular display. He dug his hooves in so her mere voice would not blow him away. "And you'll leave Big Macintosh alone?" Papa Apple said without moving from where he dug in. "Oh, his karma will be up eventually, but we imagined thou wouldst only make half-hearted attempts to collect thy offspring's soul," the dark goddess said, tossing her mane and nodding. Leaning over and grasping at nothing, she conjured a beautiful black silken cloak. It was layered thickly to hang down like a winter's belt, but still flowed and changed at the slightest movement. Whatever fabric it was, it seemed to defy anything Papa Apple had ever seen before. "Do we have a deal?" she said to him, smiling like slow and syrupy night. After a long time of staring at the cloak, he nodded once. She tossed the cloak over him and pulled the hood up over his handsome head. He stood stock still when tingly magics began to scan over his soul. He shuddered visibly, grimacing and shifting his weight back and forth. "Thou shalt have a new body when thou takest thy cloak off, but thou art mine now." She pointed with a massive hoof. "Betray me, and thy colt is mine." Papa Apple gulped, and then nodded. Reaching down, she clipped the golden clasp. Papa Apple's ghost soul burst into unholy flames, screaming and rolling around in agony. "Thy first assignment is clear. Go slay thy predecessor. He bores us." She smiled cruelly as his transformation overtook him in the most painful way imaginable. "Well, when the flames go out, that is," She watched him burn for a long time. The first time was always the worst. Pinkamena stood against Death Incarnate, armed with nothing but an ice cream scoop and a saddlebag of odds and ends. Having finally learned his identity, there was a long silence of her standing there panting. Her initial adrenaline rush had been taken out on poor, innocent Big Macintosh, who now lay splayed over the embankment, bleeding from the head. "Let's get a couple of things straight, eh?" Death said to her, cocking his head from one side to the other. "This here's what you're at." Dang it, this is hard. He's got a random southern accent to go along with his voice. Okay, here we go. "Let's get a couple of things straight, eh?" Death said to her, cocking his head from one side to the other. "This here's what you're after." He parted his cloak briefly, pulling out a mint-green puffball of what looked like sticky cloud. It was glowing slightly, idle and a little bit limp. Pinkamena leaned, then nodded once she'd gotten a good look. He put it back in his pocket, or hammer space, or whatever it may have been. "You get it off of me before I kill you, and we'll say you win, eh?" "What makes you think I won't kill you first?" Pinkamena snarled, tossing her curtain-like mane so she could see him better. Holding Steely in her hoof, she brandished it like a weapon. Death threw his head back in a great, thunderous stallion's laugh. "I got news for you, little filly. I've been dead for near 15 years now. There ain't no killin' what's already dead, I promise you." "Well, I guess I couldn't expect it to be fair, huh?" Pinkamena snarked. "Otherwise, it wouldn't be a very good trap now, would it?" They were already wandering out into the orchards. Trees passed between them, one by one, until they were safely away from Big Macintosh. "Nope." Hearing the phrase come from Papa Apple sent flashes of the crimson stallion she knew across her vision. Like father, like son. It was creepy, really. "I don't reckon." "I'll stop you this time," Pinkamena said angrily. "You've gone too far, and now I'm gonna stop you for good." "You'll try, little fella. You'll try." Papa Apple / Death reached, pulling up his hood. "Good luck beating me in my aspect form, though." Pinkamena had just enough time to shield her eyes before he clicked. The golden clasp shut and burst into flames. His skin, muscles, fur, and body burned away in moments, sending ash into the air. She squinted as he reared up, clattering his teeth and slamming his hooves down. The pink mare tittered across the ground a little, for it had shuddered with the impact. So strong, this stallion. Pinkamena licked her lips, brandishing Steely as her only weapon. If it was good enough for the son, it would certainly be good enough for the father. Shedding her saddlebag under an apple tree, she looked up, and Death was gone. She barely had time to duck as Death had appeared behind her, shorn a tree right off of its trunk, and missed her neck by inches. She saw a few pink hairs catch the breeze and fly away. Bucking wildly, she caught his shoulder and then went sprawling. Even in his skeletal form, he was much, much heavier than her. By the time she'd righted herself, he was gone again. "Don't worry, Pinkamena," she whispered, turning in quick circles so he couldn't sneak up on her. "He might have you outmatched in height and weight, age, skill, magic, strength, and power." She sagged a little, her mane falling over half of her face, but she gave it a toss. "But you can still whip his sorry flank." She held up Steely with an assertive snort, eyeing the fallen apple tree. Eyeing the fallen apple tree he just smited for no reason than to scare her. "It's not nice to do that. You know how long it takes to grow an apple tree that bears good fruit." Death reappeared in a flash of fire, solid once again. His jaw clattered back and forth, and she could practically hear him yelling something like, Don't lecture me 'bout my farming. Taking up his scythe in his teeth, he charged at her. Pinkamena shrieked wildly as he came at her with a barrage of crazy, deadly swinging. Back and forth they danced while he carved the ground, split rocks, and leveled trees to kill her. She was a nimble little minx, this one. She practically defied gravity. When he'd blasted another stone apart trying to cleave her head, he paused to look at her again. She was breathing hard, but otherwise unharmed. He heaved the weapon back into the upright position again. This was too open, too much space. She was too nimble. Rushing at her again with a thundering of hooves, he chased her in a slow circle, back and forth with a massive weapon, always pressing her backward. If only he had something to press her against. Just for a moment, he could strike her in half. Pinkamena panted a little when he paused, watching him adjust his teeth grip on the scythe and adjust his stance. When was the last time you actually fought someone? She wondered aloud. Or any pony, for that matter. She admitted, since wars were a thing only seen in history books anymore, a pony of the combat persuasion was either a royal guard or into karate like Rainbow Dash. It suddenly struck her that not even Death himself was particularly fight-savvy. He just had a fancy signature weapon. She fought down a grin, but failed. "You don't know how to swing that thing very well, do you?" she said wryly. Death cleaved the tree she had been leaning against, sending a spray of twigs and debris in all directions. She definitely lost some mane that time, for it bannered on the breeze and no longer hit her face. She ran a hoof gently over her forehead, feeling a mild scratch on her skin. Death stopped to look at her again. Not so invincible after all. Pressing his attack, he went after her relentlessly, worming through the orchard until they found themselves at the barn. Pinkamena bucked the doors open, veering back and forth so he wouldn't take her head off. The tiny lantern that lit the building was sputtering in the breeze of their deadly dancing. She finally held out steely, ready to go on the offensive. The ice cream scoop gleamed in the moonlight. She brandished it at him with a chilling glare. Standing in the massive archway of the barn with his scythe held out, Death clattered his jaw with uproarious laughter. He leaned one way, then the other. On the frame of the massive double doors, Pinkamena waited angrily. Suddenly gathering himself, he slammed both doors with a kick, trapping them inside. Lashing out with his long weapon, he shattered the lantern and set the flame upon the stray floor. The pink mare gasped as the oil lit and started spreading fast. "You'll kill us both!" she shouted angrily. Clattered laughter. Oh, right, he was already dead. Death leapt upon her as the flame shot high, licking hungrily at the barn wall and filling one of the stalls immediately. Dry hay to save for the cold seasons was going up in smoke. Heat roared across the room and started sucking the oxygen out of the air. The ponies danced a terrible dance, and finally, Pinkamena had the bravery to meet his weapon with her own. The ring of metal was loud, but even a slight block sent her reeling. He was strong. He was so strong. Adjusting herself to defend at an angle, she sent one of his swings glancing off of Steely as she walked ever backward. She wasn't a combat mare. She just didn't know how to fight an armed opponent. All it would take was one hit, and she'd be done. For the first time in a long time, fear gripped Pinkamena for her own life. This really could be it. Her flank bumped against something, and for one icy second, she chanced to look behind her when Death paused briefly to adjust his grip on the unholy blade. Stairs. Steep ones. The loft. The upper part of the barn. She gagged briefly, for the fire was growing and pressing hard with its blistering heat. Coughing loudly, she backed upward on the loft stairs, and he followed her like a spirit from Tartarus itself, vengefully swinging back and forth. Wood splintered, flying back and forth as he tried to take her hooves off, tried to cleave her skull, anything to get rid of her for good. She bumped her butt against an angled ceiling. Whinnying wildly, she threw Steely with all her might. It struck a doorstop, knocking it away. The trapdoor of the loft slammed with all its massive weight upon Death's head. She flung herself upon it, reclaiming her weapon and using her body weight to hold it closed. She tried to breathe and think. He was unstoppable. He wasn't enough wearing down like any other pony was. He was already dead, frozen at the peak of his own life, and he would never wear down. The curve of the scythe exploded through the wood of the trapdoor, up between her back legs. She shrieked, rolling wildly before another attack blasted the barrier apart. Heralded by smoke and soon flame, Death imploded out of the lower floor and up into the loft. Pinkamena reared and kicked at him wildly, swinging Steely back and forth. He blocked her with the shaft of the scythe, splitting crates and then catching her right across the chest. She tumbled with a scream of pain, blood blossoming with a straight line spatter across the floorboards. There was a pause in the battle, shock from both sides. He'd managed to get her that time. Clutching at her chest for a moment, Pinkamena's adrenaline dulled the pain as best it could, and she rose on shaking hooves. Whinnying like a wild Amazonian zebra warrior pony, she charged him head-on, swinging wildly back and forth. Death shifted, turning this way and that. Every connection of their weapons sent pain down her wrists. She clobbered him in the shoulder and he staggered. Turning to use her momentum, she was stopped by another heavy block. They were so close together, shivering with effort to overpower each other. But the massive stallion was victor. He shouldered her hard, and she went like a skipping stone into a pile of crates. She shrieked as she was buried in debris. There was silence. Death stood waiting, leaning a little and wondering if he'd finished her off. The flames sparked and popped below, already threatening the structure of the building. Covering the floor with hay and then packing a stall with hay, then lighting the place with a flame lantern. He thought he'd taught his son better, but oh well. The fire would burn the body, and one of the crates shifted as Pinkamena forced it aside with her back hooves. Grunting back upright, she shook her head again. There was a cut across her forehead that was bleeding down into her eye. She wiped it quickly, then spat to one side. "Well," she said, brandishing the steel ice cream scoop at him again. "We're not done yet. Come on!" She snapped angrily. Death heaved his weapon about again, readying for the next round. The room was filling with smoke, which strained the pink mare's lungs and vision. She coughed again, looking over her shoulder at the loft crane. Rushing, she bucked the window open to let the smoke out. Death followed quickly to simply press her out. The fall would kill her. She anticipated his assault, somersaulted forward, and comically rushed between his giant legs. The massive stallion left more than enough room for her to simply crawl under him. She gave one of his legs a good whack with Steely as she passed, and he staggered for a moment. They danced back and forth while the flames came even higher. There would be no escape. Pinkamena was pressed for time. She saw the hatch to the roof. Last chance. Guiding Death back and forth, she watched him, watched for the pattern. She saw the pattern. She was Pinkamena Diane Pie. She could see his pattern. The lull in his attacks would come. Now! She bum-rushed right into the stallion at the split second when it counted the most and knocked him down. Death was completely off guard and careened onto his side, his hooves bicycling wildly. Turning flank, the pink mare rushed up the ladder to the hatch and slammed it open. Crawling out of the loft and onto the roof, she crashed it closed again and waited. Steely raised high while she coughed. The barn was a ball of fire. There wasn't much time. Death forced the hatch just in time to get a steel ice cream scoop to the head. His hood didn't act as very good armor, needless to say. He buckled under the force like a freakish whack-a-mole, then exploded out onto the roof. Pinkamena reared, tumbling back in recoil. He slammed the hatch behind himself with a kick, blocking her escape. He reached suddenly, unclasping his cloak. His muscles, skin, and body grew back. "Y'all can't escape now, Pinkamena. You can jump and break your neck, or burn up right here. I can wait either way." He smirked. She only brandished steely at him, ready for another round. "And really now, the ice cream scoop was a little funny at first. Now it's just insulting." He shook his head a little at her, disappointed. "You could have brought anything, and that's what you picked to face down against death incarnate. Bucking insulting." He slashed his scythe to one side, burying it in the shingles of the fast-burning barn. Pinkamena recoiled as he came forward, parting his cloak for her in an inviting way. The massive stallion's chest was handsome, but riddled with scars beneath the fur, crimson fur, like blood, not like apples. It was a darker shade than the apples. She could see him for what he really was. "You became a monster," she told him. "You're not a shepherd of the dead, or anything else like it. You're just a monster." While she watched, he took off his cloak for her, tossing it over his shoulder. It landed nicely on the scythe, like it was a coat rack. His eyes burned magnificently in the cold winter night while the flames began to poke their little heads up around them, through the shingles. Pinkamena shifted back and forth, the heat steering her towards the edge of the roof as the wind shifted. The barn was turning into a shell of fire itself, the flames climbing ever higher to consume them both. "Just so's we both know you never had a chance. Take your best shot." Papa Apple poked his coiling muscled chest with one hoof. He served himself out to her, tilting his head back to present the biggest possible target for her. "Take your best bucking shot." He grinned at her from under his eyebrows. "And let the flames consume you after." He gestured with his muzzle to the fires rushing up greedily around them. Pinkamena stared at him, at the flames, at the massive crimson chest. She looked down at Steely, the foot-long ice cream scoop. She was shaking despite the blistering heat gnawing at her trimmed fetlocks. Why the buck not? Rearing up on her back legs, she gave a marish shriek, and Baseball swung at him with all her might. A massive chunk of Papa Apple's chest exploded off of him like he was made of papier-mâché. He gave a roar of agony, rearing backward with a whinny of terror. Pinkamena felt like she'd hit nothing at all, falling with a shriek. It was like punching a wet sandcastle. He drew beneath and howled again, holding the massive hunk of missing body. The edges of the injury were red hot, like someone had fired a cannonball through him. The insides were black and rotted, like he suddenly coughed red ashes, glaring at her. "Solar magic?" he demanded, mortally wounded. "Who the buck put solar magic in the bucking ice cream scoop?" Pinkamena had no idea either. This is Chapter 12 of Seeing the Pattern 2, Death Take You, by Aegis Shield, titled Death's End. Pinkamena stood upon a burning barn, cloaked in a smoking, burning hell. Death himself was on his knees before her, clutching a mortal wound. She held a solar magic enchanted weapon in one hoof, and was feverishly pushing her mane back with the other. Embers floated by in the background as smoke billowed and twisted in the cruel winter night. She scoffed a little, trying not to grin. It was like the climax of some goofy fantasy novel Twilight would read. She looked down upon her vanquished foe, raising her ice cream scoop high. She swatted his shoulder and the joint came undone, crusting away like a burnt cigarette.
His roar of pain sent him leaning the other way, favoring the other side of his body. "That was for endangering the lives of my friends." She said it finally. They were her friends. She dragged it lazily across his exposed ear, and it simply burst into ashes. He whimpered aloud, falling onto his side and trying to crawl away. The sadistic pink mare would spare him no mercy. There would be none if they were reversed. This was the end for him, and she was going to Faust-damned enjoy it. While he crawled shakily, she struck him across the back, across the spine, and upon the flank. He cried out over and over, agony igniting every fiber of his being. "For me, and for the unfair deaths you tried to inflict, and for Lickety Split, too." She named each blow as she gave it. Death rolled onto his back, scythe grasped in his hooves as he swung it wildly. She hadn't been watching where he was crawling. She'd been too intent on giving him pain, sadist that she was. Her throat came open. The scythe went flying off of the roof because of his weak grip. Blood splurted out, and icy, non-incarnate death began to dig its icy hooves into her body. No. No, no, no! She couldn't die now. She was so close. Gargling blood down her own front, she raised Steely high to finish him off while she still had the strength. He didn't have the will to move anymore, only to roll over and look up at the sky. "Pink, Death said, collapsing weakly onto his back while she loomed over him. She paused, only because of his tone. "Don't tell Big Mac, please. Please don't tell Big Mac." He begged her softly, in his low, gravelly voice. I won't," she managed, clutching at her dribbling throat. She swung with the last of her strength, using the enchanted weapon to take his head off. It exploded into red ash like somebody had placed a bottle rocket inside a watermelon. The body rolled, hit a weak spot in the roof, and crashed into the burning barn below. When it struck the ground, it imploded into more red ashes, consumed by the flames. Pinkamena fell to her knees, dropping Steely and whimpering. She was dying. The barn was burning. She could feel the heat rising and the ceiling beams starting to give. It hurt. It hurt so much. She pawed helplessly at her gushing neck. She felt herself falling through a burning, swirling mass of fire and scorched tools. Lickety. 15 years is a long time to be death. We aren't surprised he lasted so long. Pinkamena awoke on an endless, grassy plain. There were swirling storm clouds that lightly threatened her with thunder, but there was a light in the far distance, warm and inviting. "Not so fast, Pink One. We must speak." She felt a tug on her tail, and she turned. Princess Luna, the goddess of death, night, and fertility. "I guess I can listen. I'm dead, aren't I? Time doesn't mean much anymore," Pinkamena said, frowning and rolling her eyes. She turned about, then bowed as was expected before royalty. "In every sense of the word, very, very dead," the princess snarked back at her. "Thou were beaten, burned, throat cut, and scorched into nothing in that barn." She spread her wings in a rather jubilant expression of excitement, lifting a hoof to show her grand approval. "We have not seen such a glorious death in centuries." "What do you want from me, then? I'm out of your way, aren't I?" Pinkamena snapped back. "The afterlife is right there, and you still want to bother me? What could you possibly do to me that's worse than all that's happened so far?" "Thou killed Death." The princess switched to a rather serious tone very suddenly. "We are displeased. He was our lover. On his off nights, that is. She actually trailed off, and Pinkamena thought she saw a dash of pink in the goddess's face. What a mortal expression to have. Yes, I did. And with any luck, his cloak and scythe burned with us both, Pinkamena growled. I would hate for any pony to take those things and do something bad with them. Death's cloak and scythe are in our possession. Do not worry about them, Luna said dismissively, shaking her hoof like it was no big deal. However, I am without an aspect of death. She frowned down at the ghostly pink mare with a peculiar expression of caution. Oh, well, sorry I slayed your avatar. Pinkamena didn't look sorry at all. I tend to go a little crazy when some pony runs around trying to kill ponies in increasingly painful and complicated ways. Aspect, not avatar, Luna snorted. There is no stallion alive that could be the avatar of a female god, Pink One. Even thou should know that. The very idea made her chuckle a little. Perhaps the most feminine colt cuddler in the world. Nah. Whatever you want to call it, he was corrupt and he became a monster. I had to kill him to stop him. She paused for a moment. And I don't think you can execute me for murder since he technically killed me at the end himself. The pink mare made a mild gesture to her throat. Her ghost, of course, bore no such mark from the cutting blade, but it was obvious what she meant. It is true, Luna said after a long time, tilting her head back and looking at the cloud-covered sky. After you began interrupting his work, he became angrier and angrier, more unstable, she admitted. Pinkamena looked at her carefully. He was brooding and dark, yes, but it is hard not to be when one is the aspect of death, she said. He did his work. He was friends with the other aspects. And he started actively going after my friends and I after I started noticing him, Pinkamena snapped, not about to let her defend him. He deserved what he got, and you know it. The point being... Princess Luna boomed a little dangerously, trying to get back on topic. We are without an aspect of death, and we seem to only have one candidate. Thou, she said, pointing a hoof to Pinkamena's chest. The pink mare blinked at her, pushing her ghostly mane behind her ear. What? She said. I just killed death. I can't be death. She shook her head. Thou dost not grasp the severity of thy situation, Luna said with a rather dark glare. Thou killed death, the shepherd of the dead and the deliverer of lost souls. Without him, those that are meant to die will not, and the idle souls of the world will wander, lost, and never find their paradise in the great beyond. She gestured to the inviting light on the horizon. Thunder rolled a little more loudly overhead. Pinkamena stared at her, growing more and more afraid. She shivered in all four of her knees, then fell forward a little as she realized what she had done. So thou sees, Pinkamena. The goddess addressed her by name for the first time, in a more gentle tone. She sidled up beside the pink mare. There must always be an aspect of death, and, as far back as we can remember, each death has always killed the one that came before him, or her. But wait, you've been imprisoned in the moon for the past 1,000 years. How could you have possibly seen a succession of so many deaths? Pinkamena was confused. Imprisoned physically, yes, but this is not a physical place, as real as it may feel. Princess Luna gestured to the grasses before their hooves. What dost thou think we did while we were on the moon for 1,000 years? Sit and count rocks? Stare at the sky? Nay, we were here, quietly shepherding the dead and overseeing the aspect of death. She gestured mildly, watching the mantle go from one pony to the next, through the ages. Pinkamena fell to her knees, staring up at the sky as all the pieces came together. Death could only function as long as he was uncorrupt. Then he would be noticed by his successor, slain, and his place taken by the next to death. Is that what awaits me? She turned, asking the goddess softly. Her eyes were soft. My successor will kill me to take my place? Yes, said Luna gently, but only after a very, very long time, considering that ponies can live to 50 or so in this era, and thou art already 20-something. Thy life would end in the same frame of time anyway. Isn't my life already over, though? She'd already accepted the position and was moving forward with questions. The job comes with perks, Pink One, said the goddess of the night, smirking. Thou canst be death all the time. You will receive a new body, and since no one saw you die, you may walk among the living like nothing happened. Papa Apple's death was witnessed by his son, so he could not return or face exposure. So, I can't tell any pony I'm death? Pinkamena mumbled. This was all so much to take in all at once. It was making her flush and hyperventilate a little bit. There is much to learn, Death. Luna gestured to thin air, and a black cloak appeared. Death's cloak. Leaning, she plucked it out of the air and draped it over Pinkamena's ghost. But for now, thou shalt rest. Go home. Be with thy stallion. Come to us when thou art ready, and we shalt train you. Leaning down a little, she kissed Pinkamena on the forehead. Thou shalt emerge from a bath of fire. Now, go. She swatted Pinkamena's forehead with her hoof. The space between spaces vanished. Pinkamena awoke to find her hooves thundering across the fiery floor of the barn, carrying her out into the night. A black cloak flew on her back like a banner, a spectacular coat of arms to her new vocation. Leaping with a whinny of triumph, she flushed as the winter air struck her. Her skin recoiled from the chilling air. Her breath was a cloud. She was alive. She felt herself all over, even her mane. She was alive. Something puffy and mint green floated idly past her, looking like it was in no real hurry to go anywhere. That was no cloud. Lickety! She ran and made a snatch for his soul, and her hoof went right through it. She stopped, frustrated, pawing at it several times. For some reason, she just couldn't grasp it. She tried all different angles, but she couldn't grab it. Huffing angrily, she tried to glare into submission like she did with her stallion sometimes. No good. His soul was made of sterner stuff. She looked down at the golden clasp on the cloak. She'd seen Death handle souls with his bare hooves. Wasn't that clasp how Death activated his, death powers? She frowned. That sounded so corny. What had Luna called him? The aspect of death? Aspect powers? That sounded more official. Taking a deep breath, she backed up a bit, pulling the cloak before herself. Pulling the hood up, she shuddered. His scent was there, apples and sweat. He really was a farmer. Shaking her head quickly, she grasped the golden clasp and closed it. Nothing happened for a long time. Why wasn't anything happening? She looked down at her hooves suddenly. Her hooves were smoking. She turned them up one at a time to look at them. She gave a sudden, full-throated scream when both of her eyeballs suddenly exploded. Blinded by agony, she clutched at her face and staggered about. Her tail caught on fire. She bucked wildly until suddenly her joints were ablaze with pain and she had to stop. She moaned, flailing and bucking and screaming as bits of her began to be consumed by flame. She cried out into the night, and orange flames exploded from every orifice as her body began to violently burn. Her beautiful face and lips melted away into nothing, The pearly white bone beneath was exposed, bit by bit. Her hooves exploded into flame, and her back arched. She staggered forward, clutching at her head and writhing about, leaving hoofprints that burned by themselves. No! No, you tricked me! It hurts! No! Ah! Every bit of flesh imploded from her frame, leaving only bone and cloak behind. Grass and dirt rushed away from her in a great ring, and she fell forward into exhaustion. On the edge of another dimension, in the space between spaces, Luna winced. The first transformation was always the hardest. Death picked itself up slowly. She looked around. She wasn't in pain anymore. She wasn't dead like she thought she would be. She just felt different, lighter, stronger, much stronger. She eyed the mint green soul floating slowly on the breeze. Padding through the snow, she reached up and grasped it as though it were a solid object. Lickety split. She tried to say his name, but could not. She had no tongue. She panicked briefly, but then remembered what she was supposed to be doing in the first place. Lovingly, she stored the soul in the warm folds of her cloak. He would be safe there. Smiling inwardly, she started a strong gallop home. She didn't need to breathe. She had no lungs. She didn't pant. She felt like she could run forever. The night masked her journey home, and when the coast was clear, she slipped into the ice cream parlor and pulled all of the shades. She didn't know how to be invisible to every pony yet. Better to be safe. Making sure all the doors were locked and all the lights were off, she approached Lickety Split's body. Taking out the soul, she leaned over him. Was she supposed to stuff it in his mouth, or what? Fumbling for a bit, she simply placed it on his chest. The soul rolled like a raindrop until it was over his kidney? Odd place to keep one's soul, but she would make a note of it. It sank into him like lotion after a few rubs, and suddenly the stallion was stirring with a deep breath of waking. Panicking briefly, Death unclasped the golden bit on the cloak. A rush of magic brought her flesh and blood back. "Pinky?" Lickety said quietly, turning weakly on his side to face her. "Shh," she said gently, pushing back the hood and leaning to nuzzle him quietly. "Just don't talk. It's over now. Just don't talk." Pinkamena stroked his belly and chest over and over, which made him murmur pleasurably. She clambered onto the couch with him after shedding the cloak. She just wanted to be pressed up against him. Just wanted to rest. This is Chapter 13 of Seeing the Pattern 2, Death Take You, by Aegis Shield, titled The Great Beyond. Princess Luna was sitting on her haunches in the space between spaces. Next to her sat the ghost of Papa Apple, twice dead now, feeling naked without his cloak or scythe. "Welp, I guess that's it for me then," he said a little glumly. The dark alicorn looked over at him, smiling a little grimly. He was a handsome thing, blood-red fur and an orange mane. The criss-crossing scars visible under his fur all over his body just made him look exotic to her. "Thy service to me was commendable, stallion. Thy send-off was an honorable one." She spoke rather softly, no aggression in her voice. "Thou fell before a worthy opponent, serving thy goddess. This pleases us, she told him. Because of her sheer height, she could tuck his head under her chin because of how close they were sitting together. What's out there? Papa Apple found himself quietly asking. Beyond that thar horizon. He gestured to the magnetic pole of the great beyond. He was very careful not to look directly at it, for any dead soul would be drawn to it like a moth to a flame, a need to be there. The great beyond? Princess Luna said, sliding a hoof around his massive frame. That is the one thing alicorns may never know. Our immortality prevents us from visiting it, for we never truly die. She admitted with a sympathetic smile. There was a long silence between them. This conversation was the one the Dark Goddess had been dreading for over a decade. Just think, thy wife will be awaiting thou. She is also dead, yes? She told him, offering a weak smile. Papa Apple snickered a little. I'll miss you too, your majesty, he told her. Her head sagged a little shamefully. So readable she was sometimes. Scratching herself a little awkwardly, she tucked his head once more under her chin and embraced him. The stallion felt small for the first time in a long time. His great arms rose up to wrap around her, stroking her back. Theirs was a strange, angry, biting, lusty relationship. But it had worked in its own freakish way, and not just in the bedroom. Both had been lonely for different reasons, and had found each other through vocation. Being death was a lonely road, especially when one could not come into contact with the living. Being a goddess wasn't much different. The forbidden fruit no stallion would dare touch. Call it animalistic, but they'd met under a certain understanding years ago, and had enjoyed each other while they could. It was all over now, though. She could give him a new body, yes, but why? He couldn't go home. He couldn't be death again. His life was over now. Twice. It was for the stallion to move on. Papa Apple, she said softly, pulling back to look at the massive stallion. Oh, shucks. You can just call me Apple, you know. I'm not your papa. He snickered a little, and the princess smiled with a hoof over her mouth. Unashamed, the two ponies shared a quiet kiss. Their last. Slowly, he pulled away and faced the dreamy horizon of the great beyond. Goodbye, Luna. He smiled his charming smile, pushing his mane out of his face. Goodbye, Apple, she whispered, unable to gather volume to her voice. She watched him walk towards his final horizon, a soul at peace. Come back, she wanted to shout. Come back, serve me again. Come back, we shalt give you a new body and a new job, and thou shalt stay with me. She couldn't form the words, though. He was so handsome, so stoic walking forward like that. She imprinted the memory of his handsome stance, his determination. Goodbye. Goodbye, she whispered, as her head began to hang mournfully low. The goddess of death wept quietly, alone in the space between spaces. Such a wonderful stallion. Luna thought she could hear his final, joyful words as he came closer to the light at the end of the horizon. Oh wow. Oh wow. Beautiful. Celestia mumbled over another scroll that had been sent to her from who cares what pony noble about not very important state problem. She reached for her tea, but found it tasted of quiet morning, saturated on some ethereal level, where no other pony could taste it save her. A message from her sister. Though it was late in the afternoon, and this was often Luna's sleeping time, she was awake and wanting for company. Rare it was for sisters to gather for a reason not related to running Equestria. Rising, the goddess of the day gave a quiet sigh. That was noise enough to alert her guards of royal movement. Spreading her wings regally, the solar princess started away from her study and towards her sister's room. The servants made way for the white alicorn as she went from one tower of the palace to another, flanked by her twin guards. Passing tapestry after statue after stained glass window, she favored a few ponies with smiles or kind words, but never stopped. Celestia stopped before the great onyx doors, looking at the lunar stallion posted at either side. They bowed respectfully, and their solar counterparts took their places next to them. Nodding with a serene smile, she went inside. The midnight curtains kept out the day, the candles keeping a half-light that her dark sister could bear. "Thy interference hath cost me a powerful stallion," Luna's voice said from the darkest corner. Think I did not see the blatant solar magic in Pinkamina's weapon of choice. She may not have realized it, but I did. She was sour, and her eyes betrayed crying? Celestia was understandably caught off guard. Her sister never wept. "I did what I had to stop all the madness," Celestia said gently, coming forward and nuzzling her sister comfortingly. Luna was a little still, but didn't lash out at her. "Death was going way out of line, and you know it, dear sister," she crooned quietly, leaning and pulling a misaligned feather in her sister's wingspan. She flinched at the preening and sighed. "Perhaps, but that does not mean he could not have been reined in," Luna said, though she knew she was only trying to convince herself. The aspect of death was meant to be a powerful shepherd of the dead, and grasper of the souls of those that refused to move on when their time was up. She sighed and leaned forward into her sister's shoulder. The sisters enveloped each other in their massive wings, an ancient gesture only they shared. Like two great swans, they crooned at each other comfortingly. "We did not intend all this madness. Ever since Pinkamena emerged, nothing but madness." The dark goddess sighed. Celestia knew it was the closest she would get to an apology, but the tone was sincere, so she was satisfied. "And now she is the new death," the sun goddess said gently, almost like it was a question. "Yes, we shall need to train her carefully. No one saw her die, so she's at much greater risk of being exposed than our stallion was." Luna referred to him, unashamed, as her own. Celestia gave her a look, but got no apologies or embarrassed glances. She hadn't known they'd been romantically involved. "Pinkamena shall be a death with a feather-light touch." She rolled her eyes a little, shaking her head with a smirk. "What makes you say that?" Celestia asked. "Her cutie mark talent is preventing deaths, and she's just become the aspect of death," Luna snarked a little. "Talent and vocation at opposite ends. She shall always be looking for excuses not to kill any pony. She smiled at the irony. Death isn't normally supposed to kill any pony, though, Celestia reminded her. We know, but when the time comes, and she feels the urge that the cloak gives her. Luna paused a moment to word it correctly. Her decision shall be tempered with more mercy than the job hast previously employed. It will be interesting to watch her do it. Pinkamena awoke in the late morning with Lickety lazily stroking her. She turned her head only slightly, looking at him. The sun came through the window in a heavenly beam that heated the room rather nicely for the winter time. He leaned over her, pressing his lips to her forehead. She growled slightly, turning on her side. She'd been out so late doing she could never explain, and she smelled like smoke. Lickety, she croaked at him. Hi, he whispered quietly, his expression soft and loving. You saved me again. The white, green-maned stallion praised her quietly, nuzzling up and down with slow, heady motions. She rested there until she came more and more awake. Not my fault you couldn't take care of your own soul. She sulked a little, turning her head to one side. He nibbled on her ear instead until she gave a slight giggle and pulled it from his mouth. I have you to look after me, though, he crooned softly, reaching towards the end table. He held something high, over the sun coming in the window. The pink mare squinted at it hard. Forever. He turned the golden, glittering object a little before bringing it down. The engagement hoop. She'd promised to marry him after she'd conquered death. She swallowed a little, pondering technicalities. Well, she'd beaten death, but now she was death. Did that count? She didn't know. Pinkamena was a little scowly in her private thoughts, and only cocked her head when he gently took her hoof with his. Marry me? Lickety-Split whispered. She stared at the golden hoop hovering over the tip of her right front hoof for a long time. She licked her lips a little, looking into his loving face. There was a long silence. He began to wilt and look sad, and she finally shoved her hoof through. The hoop held above her ankle like it was supposed to. Lickety beamed at her, then leaned over her for a deep kiss. She held his face firmly with one hoof, closing her eyes pleasantly. Lickety, Pinkamena said drowsily, a little caught up in the heady feeling of the stallion paying such good attention to her. She didn't trust herself not to pounce on him right then, but then half the day would go to waste. She'd fall asleep, curled up with him, and there was plenty to do. Nosing his cheek, she rose authoritatively, determined to shake off sleep. He nibbled at her shorn fetlock a little, and she jittered back, scolding him with her eyes. He lay there, splayed out and very much on display for her. Now where had he picked up that little trick, she wondered with a smirk. I still smell like smoke, she told him, crossing the room towards the bathroom. If any pony asks you about the Sweet Apple Acres barn burning down, act surprised about it, she called over her shoulder. Right, Lickety-Split smiled bemusedly. That whole saving my soul thing, right? She nodded at him, stepping into the bathroom to freshen up. By the time she emerged again, she felt much better. Didn't smell of smoke, and had coaxed her mane into something more presentable. She examined the hoop on her ankle, turning it back and forth. "So, what are you gonna do with your day?" Lickety asked her from the kitchen. "The same thing any mare does when she gets an engagement hoop," Pinkamena snorted, rolling her eyes at her silly stallion. "I'm gonna go show it off to every pony." She went to the kitchen, grabbed a banana from the hook, pecked his cheek, and was off. He smiled, watching her go. Her genuine smiles really were radiant.